Both of my wife's parents are Ethiopian, and in 2011, my father-in-law passed. And my mother-in-law came to stay with us for a little while. After months of her husband passing, I noticed that each time a person called to give their condolences, she'd weep out loud. And sometimes this would happen in the backseat of a car. It could be anywhere. And as an American, I watched this and I hoped that no one would call her anymore. Because, I was thinking, well, this can't be healthy for folks to keep ripping off the scab of this wound, and she has to re-experience all those emotions. But in her culture, mourning's not a private affair, as it was in Jesus' culture. Mourning was designed to be communal and done with those that we love. And as I reflect and I think back on that experience, I think my wife's people were on to something that we've long lost. Now let's do a quick review. Then I'm going to pick up where Jesus teaches us about mourning. But let's go back. Matthew 5:3. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." This blessing was the first blessing because anyone could start here. Someone said, imagine if Jesus started with, "Blessed are the pure in heart." We'd all be disqualified before we even got started. If a ladder is to be of any use, it must have its first step near the ground, where it can be accessible to anyone. So imagine a nation where all its citizens recognize their own moral poverty before pointing out others. Racial and social superiority would quickly become a relic of the past. Jesus goes on, "For theirs is the kingdom." This fundamental requirement for entrance into God's kingdom was, I think, best articulated by King David. He said this, "My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, O God, will not despise." C.S. Lewis said this, "The doors of hell are locked from the inside because the inhabitants enjoy forever the horrible freedom from God that they have so adamantly demanded." Likewise, the keys of the kingdom are within. The only thing that keeps anyone out is our internal no. Jesus promised this. He said, "Ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall find, knock and the door will be open to you." If you want to enter the kingdom, just ask and you will receive, and you can begin this process that we're talking about, where each step rises from the former and depends on the last. And the humbler we grow, the higher we rise. Are you ready to move on to the second rung of the ladder? And then he goes on and says again, "Blessed." Now the reason this section has been called the Beatitudes for centuries is because the Latin Vulgate uses the word beate for blessed. I like to add the suffix "tude." Have you ever encountered someone with a tude? Yeah, sure you have. And tude speaks of the quality or the condition of mind. Put the two together, Jesus is speaking about the attitude of a blessed mind. Change your mind, change your life. He said, "Blessed," watch this, "are those who mourn." That's an absurdity, but watch what he said. Blessed are those who what? Mourn. Again, true social justice begins with personal repentance. Those who mourn are those who are willing to own their own stuff, face their own failings, without deflecting, without denying, without minimizing, without justifying. If we are really our brother's keepers, we would rejoice with those who rejoice, but we'd also mourn with those who mourn. So here's the question. Has the church community mourned with every phone call? Like my mother-in-law, over the millions lost in the transatlantic slave trade. Have we truly mourned over the impact of hundreds of years of chattel slavery, sharecropping, convict leasing, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and national programs that have helped remove black males from the home and the family? Have we mourned over the fact that African American women are several times as likely as white women to terminate their pregnancy? I can go on, but we mourned over the 2,997 people that were viciously murdered on 9/11 with this slogan, "We will never forget." But Chinese Americans, African Americans, Native Americans are told constantly to forget. We can't move on until we ask God to break our hearts with the things that break His. And then Jesus continues, "For they shall be comforted." This promise of comfort is only for those who first feel the pain. So we can't let social media, mainstream media, political parties, and way off track religious organizations continue to desensitize and polarize us. Solomon tells us this. He said, "To everything there is a season, a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. And I've noticed a pattern. The pain leaves us only after we let it finish teaching us. And if we would together admit our personal and national shortcomings, as in step one, imagine if we mourned and empathized with those who have been hurt on rung two. We will be well on our way toward healing our land. But you might guess the third step would be resolution, but you'd be wrong. Yes, we must face our poverty on the first rung. Yes, we must feel it on the second. But we can't even think about trying to fix it until we've climbed to this next rung. And again, he begins on this next step, blessed. The term translated blessed here in the Beatitude could be read enviable or fortunate. It speaks of happiness that comes from having an eye toward the benefits. It's the type of happiness that comes from knowing it may not be easy, but in the end it will be worth it. He continues, blessed are the meek. Now, this was an extremely countercultural statement that Jesus makes here. Meekness was not something to brag about in Roman culture, but Jesus had a knack of turning conventional wisdom on its head. Meekness can best be illustrated as a powerful ox that uses its power to do what it has been trained to do instead of using its strength to run wild. Meekness is never to be confused with weakness. It's really strength under control, the ability, the willingness to control our passions as the slave class in the first century had to do. And that's why Romans did not love this term. Meekness is when a powerful stallion wants to go one way, but the rider wants to go another. And he responds, not my will, but your will be done. So after we boldly face our spiritual poverty, bravely feel the impact of our wrong decisions and how they impacted others as well as ourselves, and we mourn with godly sorrow, the next step is to become a fit instrument for the Master's use. You know, when I was growing up, my dad was often trying to fix things, and when he'd see something that was broke and we didn't have the right tool, which was, almost inevitable, it happened all the time, he would say, son, hand me the ignorant tool. Now, I love this part because I knew he would try to beat whatever it was to make it do what he wanted it to do. But in the long run, it usually created just new problems for us. Ambrose in Milan said, no one heals himself by wounding another. A meek person is one who suffers wrong without becoming bitter, without seeking revenge. It's the ability to even ignore your own judgment, to follow your leader because you have confidence that he knows what you do not know. And then he goes on, Jesus says, for they shall inherit the earth. Isaiah 53:7 tells us, Jesus was led as a lamb to slaughter and a sheep before his shearer. He opened not his mouth in protest. He looked like a fool to those who watched, but he remained meek before the plan of God and submitted all his strength to the Father. There was a poem that was written about 100 years ago that describes the impact of this one man's meekness on the entire globe. The writer says this, he was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in still another village where he worked as a carpenter. He worked in a shop until he was about 30. Then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held office. He never had a family or owned a house. He didn't go to college. He never visited a big city. He never traveled more than 200 miles from the place he was born. He did none of the things one would usually associate with greatness. He had no credentials. His only credential was himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. He was turned over to his enemies. He went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing, his only property that the Bible says he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity, really, of a friend. 20 centuries have come and gone, and today he is still the central figure of the human race. 2.4 billion people call themselves Christians today, and he's the leader of the column of progress. All the armies that have ever marched, all the navies that have ever sailed, all the congresses that have ever sat, all the kings that have ever reigned, put together have not affected people on earth as much as this man. The meek are those who have learned to submit their cause to God, like Jesus did on the cross. They've learned to trust God's ways even when it doesn't feel good. Can you handle one more step before we go on to the next video? Verse 6, Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst." Now, if your stomach has ever been empty or you've ever been dry, you know hunger and thirst are very, very powerful motivators. They're natural, they're painful, they're intense, but they can also be a sign of health. One of the first things that happens to you when you have a cold or you're sick or something is typically you lose your appetite. And Jesus is teaching us that hunger and thirst are actually signs of spiritual fitness. He said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst," watch the next two words, "for righteousness." The object of this hunger and this thirst is what? Righteousness. A true relationship with God is not asking God to care about what you don't really care about. It's hungering and thirsting for the things that God desires in your life. Sometimes the reason we don't get more in our lives and in society is because we just don't want it badly enough. Imagine if we got hungry and thirsty enough, desperate enough for righteousness that we were willing to expand our circle of friends to include people who are of the same faith, but maybe they think differently than us. Maybe they vote differently than us. Imagine if we got hungry and thirsty enough to do what I did as a young man and find a church led by people who looked and thought differently. I wrote about this in the 4th chapter of my book, When God Stops. And in it I said, studies have shown that upwards of 65% of those who identify as Christians are not active in any church. So imagine if those who have gotten to this step on the ladder but do not already have a home church and they decided to put some skin in the game. Imagine if this disillusioned majority did more than just complain about the church's many shortcomings, but became active in a church led by a pastor of another ethnicity. It would do the same thing that it did to my pastor many years ago. Eventually, the congregational leaders would become uncomfortable holding unexamined and misinformed attitudes that negatively impacted a significant portion of their congregation, or they'd have to leave. Then Jesus continued, "For they shall be filled." Now, the self-righteous are already so filled with their own righteousness, they have no room for God. So this doesn't apply to them. But those of us who are willing to face hard truths, feel the pain of others, become fit instruments of healing, and want God's will strongly enough to fight through some of the inconveniences that we might face to get to it. Those folks will enter the second half of the ladder and begin to fix the problem that has been an issue in our nation for hundreds of years. Now, we're going to pick up here in the next video. Don't miss my conclusion and what you can do next. God bless you.
Hi, I'm David Grier. Why are churches across the United States dedicating the second weekend in June each year to uniting across political, racial, and socioeconomic lines to healing the racial divide? Because Jesus said if a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. If we do not take steps to destroy our racial fault lines, it will only be a matter of time before they destroy us. In the final video, my dad will share with you a roadmap to personal and national transformation that has been hidden in plain sight for over 2,000 years. In the last session, he introduced to you the first of 8 essential qualities that God wants to develop in you and then use to change the people in the world around you.